They said he was just another passenger in seat 16A, but that was the first mistake everyone made that day. The cabin of the modified military transport aircraft was quiet in a way that felt engineered rather than natural, a controlled silence maintained by protocol, altitude, and discipline. Seat 16A was located near the mid-rear section of the aircraft, positioned beside a narrow window that reflected the pale blue curvature of the sky outside. The man seated there appeared unremarkable at first glance. John Miller, according to the boarding manifest, was listed as civilian transport clearance level standard, no special designation, no escort, no priority handling. He wore a simple dark jacket, hands resting calmly in his lap, posture relaxed but precise in a way that suggested long familiarity with structured environments. Around him, the cabin carried the subtle tension of mixed personnel, flight engineers, 2 uniformed air crew members, and a small group of observers traveling under military coordination. Conversations were minimal, broken only by clipped operational phrases and the occasional sound of equipment checks. Yet despite the routine atmosphere, there was an underlying irregularity that had already begun to spread through the aircraft's internal systems. In the forward cockpit interface, a background diagnostic sequence flagged a minor inconsistency tied to passenger verification logs. It was not dramatic enough to trigger an alarm, but it was persistent enough to draw attention from the flight captain, Daniel Hayes, a man accustomed to trusting machines until they showed him a reason not to. He glanced once at the secondary monitor, then a second time, slower, as the system attempted to reconcile John Miller's boarding credentials with a restricted archival database that was not normally referenced during civilian transport. The anomaly did not resolve. Instead, it deepened. In the rear cabin, a flight technician moved past seat rows with routine efficiency, pausing briefly near 16A, as if something about the space felt statistically out of place, though he could not articulate why. The man in seat 16A did not react. He continued to look out the window, observing cloud formations drifting beneath the aircraft with quiet attention, as though reading patterns that others could not see. Minutes passed. The aircraft maintained steady altitude, engines humming with controlled power. Inside mission control channels, a low-priority data packet was rerouted through encrypted military verification systems, triggered not by human command, but by automated cross-referencing. That was when the first subtle shift occurred. In a distant operations hub, a system designed for aerial coordination and defense readiness briefly paused a non-essential simulation. It did not identify a threat. It identified a name. Or rather, a designation buried so deep within classification layers that it should not have been active in any civilian flight profile. The designation did not display fully on any open screen, but it was enough to cause a quiet recalibration across multiple systems. Meanwhile, inside the cabin, John Miller adjusted his position slightly, a small movement that caused no disturbance, but seemed to coincide precisely with the moment the aircraft's internal communication channel tightened its encryption level without human input. Captain Daniel Hayes noticed the shift first, not th. The aircraft maintained steady altitude, as if nothing unusual had occurred, yet inside the forward cockpit the situation had already shifted into a quieter, more controlled state of analysis. Captain Daniel Hayes no longer treated the irregularity as a minor system fluctuation. Instead, he had moved it into a category that required silent verification, the kind that did not trigger alarms but demanded attention from anyone trained to recognize patterns beneath routine flight data. The secondary monitor continued to cycle through passenger validation logs, but now additional layers of archival cross-referencing had been activated. Each layer returned the same result: incomplete, restricted, or partially redacted information tied to the identity listed as John Miller in seat 16A. The absence of clarity was more concerning than any explicit warning could have been. In the rear cabin, life continued with deliberate normality. Flight engineers checked equipment restraints, a technician adjusted a storage panel, and 2 uniformed personnel discussed altitude stability in low voices. Yet even within that structured environment, subtle behavioral changes had begun to emerge. People were no longer simply passing seat 16A without thought. Their attention lingered for fractions of a second longer than necessary, as if the space itself was exerting a quiet gravitational pull on awareness. The man in seat 16A remained unchanged in demeanor. John Miller sat with the same calm posture, hands resting naturally, gaze occasionally shifting toward the window where layered cloud systems drifted beneath the aircraft. There was no visible indication that he acknowledged the subtle shift in attention around him. However, at nearly the exact moment Captain Hayes initiated a secondary verification request through encrypted channels, John Miller's head tilted slightly, not toward any person in the cabin, but toward the aircraft structure itself, as if responding to a frequency not audible to others. In the cockpit, the communication interface registered a brief synchronization event that had no assigned origin point. It was not a system error. It was classified as an external acknowledgement handshake, though no external entity was officially linked to the aircraft's current flight path. Captain Hayes felt a shift in operational awareness that he could not ignore. He adjusted his headset and initiated a controlled query through secure military routing channels, bypassing standard civilian oversight protocols. The request was simple in structure but high in clearance level. Confirm identity validity for passenger designation John Miller, seat 16A, including any historical operational cross-references. The response delay was longer than acceptable for a system of this caliber. During that delay, the aircraft continued forward, engines steady, altitude unchanged, yet the internal perception of time within the cockpit felt subtly compressed. When the response finally arrived, it did not come as a single file. It came as a segmented data stream requiring multiple authorization keys to reconstruct. As Captain Hayes began assembling the segments, a secondary alert appeared on a separate classified channel that he had not personally opened. It contained only one line of text: dormant designation reactivated. In the rear cabin, a junior officer walking past seat 16A paused for a brief moment, then continued without comment. Later, when asked, he would not be able to explain why he stopped. He would only recall that for a fraction of a second, the air around that seat felt as if it belonged to a different operational context entirely. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Captain Hayes reached the final segment of the reconstructed file. What he saw did not match any standard civilian classification structure. It was not simply an identity record. It was a historical designation file tied to aviation command hierarchy levels that had not been publicly referenced in over a decade. And at the center of that file, partially masked by protocol encryption, was a call sign that caused every auxiliary system in the cockpit to momentarily stabilize into complete silence before resuming normal function, as if the aircraft itself had acknowledged something it was not permitted to announce aloud. The moment the encrypted call sign stabilized within the cockpit systems, the entire operational environment aboard the aircraft shifted into a new state of controlled uncertainty. Nothing visible changed in the cabin, yet every layer of digital infrastructure connected to flight monitoring, communication routing, and classification access had entered a silent mode of recalibration. Captain Daniel Hayes remained still in his seat, eyes locked on the reconstructed file stream as it finalized its decrypted structure. The designation was no longer fragmented. It now existed as a complete operational identity entry, but heavily restricted, as if the system itself was resisting full disclosure. Across the mid-cabin, the atmosphere remained outwardly unchanged. Seat 16A still held the same man, still calm, still observing the world outside the window with the same quiet attention. However, the perception of that stillness had begun to change among trained personnel. It was no longer interpreted as absence of importance. It was beginning to register as controlled presence. In the cockpit, a second verification layer activated automatically without Captain Hayes issuing a command. This layer was reserved for legacy aviation command structures, systems that only engaged when historical operational codes matched current flight conditions. The interface dimmed briefly before presenting a designation header that did not belong to any active registry. The header was not fully readable at first, appearing as a partial classification string that resolved slowly over several seconds. When it finally stabilized, it triggered a momentary interruption across multiple onboard systems, not an alarm, but a synchronization pause, as if every connected module had been instructed to acknowledge the same unseen authority. Captain Hayes felt a tightening focus rather than panic. His training did not allow emotional reaction to data, only procedural response. He initiated a secure communication link to ground command. But before the connection fully established, the aircraft's internal systems issued a preemptive lock on outgoing queries related to the designation now displayed. This was not standard protocol behavior. It indicated a higher authorization override embedded within the aircraft's own historical data framework. In the cabin, a flight engineer passing through the aisle slowed briefly as he crossed the midpoint near seat 16A. He did not speak, did not acknowledge anything directly, but his movement hesitated for less than a second before continuing forward. Later analysis of onboard logs would classify this as a subconscious environmental response trigger, though no one on board would describe it in such technical terms at the moment. The man in seat 16A remained unchanged. John Miller's expression did not shift, nor did his posture suggest awareness of the systems reacting around him. Yet at the exact moment the cockpit finalized the identity reconstruction, he adjusted his hands slightly, a minimal movement that coincided precisely with the stabilization of the encrypted call sign across all internal displays. The coincidence was too precise for anyone trained in systems. Behavior to ignore, but too subtle to assign intent. Captain Hayes leaned closer to the display as the final layer of classification resolved. The file did not simply reveal a name or rank structure. It referenced operational coordination across multiple Air Force units under a designation that had been archived under special historical protection. The more he read, the more the structure of the information suggested that this identity was not meant to be active during any standard passenger transport scenario. And yet it was active now. At that exact moment, the aircraft's external communication array received a silent inbound verification pulse from an outside military network. No voice transmitted. No message was displayed. Only a confirmation signal, brief and absolute, that aligned perfectly with the call sign now visible in the cockpit systems. Captain Hayes did not speak. He simply recognized what the system had already decided. The presence in seat 16A was not a passenger in the traditional sense. It was a recognized point of authority within a hierarchy that the aircraft itself had just been reminded to remember. The aircraft entered a phase of operational stability that no longer matched its original mission profile. Every system on board, from navigation to communications to internal environmental controls, was now subtly influenced by the presence of a classified designation that had been partially restored within its memory architecture. Captain Daniel Hayes understood this clearly, even if no official protocol explicitly described what was happening. He was no longer observing a simple anomaly. He was witnessing an authority recognition event embedded deep within legacy military aviation systems. In the mid-cabin, the environment remained outwardly unchanged, yet perception itself had shifted among trained personnel. Seat 16A was no longer treated as an ordinary passenger location. It had become a reference point for every glance that moved too quickly past it and every pause that lasted too long near it. The man seated there, John Miller, remained still, maintaining the same composed posture, hands resting naturally, eyes directed toward the open sky beyond the window. There was no visible indication of involvement in the complex systems reacting around him, yet every layer of aircraft intelligence continued to respond as though his presence carried structured significance. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes observed a new layer of data appear within the restricted interface. It was not a continuation of the earlier file, but a contextual overlay that connected historical operational records with current flight conditions. This overlay did not simply confirm identity. It confirmed operational relevance. The designation associated with Seat 16A had once been tied to coordinated air command activities involving multiple strategic units. Those records had been archived under strict protocols, yet the system was now treating them as active reference points rather than historical entries. Without verbal instruction, the aircraft initiated a controlled communication handshake with external military satellites. The handshake was not a request. It was a confirmation exchange. Somewhere beyond the visible horizon, multiple airborne units began subtle recalibration of their formation logic. At the same time, inside the cabin, a faint change in ambient pressure perception was noted by a flight technician, though no instrumentation indicated any physical shift in cabin conditions. He paused briefly, then continued walking, Unable to explain why the atmosphere near seat 16A felt mathematically precise rather than emotionally noticeable. Captain Hayes now had access to a secondary classification line within the system. It was not fully decrypted, but the partial structure indicated a command-level designation that operated outside standard rank hierarchies. This was not about rank in the conventional sense. It was about recognition authority embedded into legacy flight command doctrine. As he analyzed the structure, a second external signal arrived, stronger than the previous one. This time, it carried a directional signature consistent with airborne military assets in nearby operational airspace. The signal did not request identification. It acknowledged alignment. In the mid-cabin, John Miller finally shifted his gaze. Slightly, not toward the cockpit, not toward any person, but toward the horizon outside the window where distant aircraft activity could be faintly perceived. The movement was minimal, but it coincided with a precise stabilization of all onboard systems, as if the aircraft had completed a recognition loop that required no further validation. Captain Hayes noticed it immediately. The synchronization was not accidental. It was responsive. The system had completed its internal confirmation cycle, and what remained was no longer uncertainty. It was acknowledgement without announcement, authority without display, and presence without declaration. Seat 16A had transitioned from anomaly to reference point within the aircraft's operational awareness, and every system on board now functioned with the quiet understanding that it was sharing space with something it was trained to recognize, but not often required to encounter. The cabin of a commercial flight from Dallas to San Diego felt unusually quiet, the hum of engines blending with soft overhead lighting as passengers settled into their routines. But in seat 16A, an elderly man remained still, hands folded, eyes calm, as if the noise around him did not belong to the same world he was in. Across the aisle, a young woman in a United States Air Force uniform adjusted her tablet, reviewing flight coordination notes for an upcoming training operation, occasionally glancing at the man with a subtle curiosity she could not explain. His presence carried a kind of stillness that did not match the ordinary setting, as if he had lived through decades of moments where silence meant more than words. The aircraft cruised at 35,000 feet, and the flight attendants moved with practiced efficiency, unaware that something unspoken was beginning to form between two strangers seated only a few feet apart. The man in seat 16A reached into a worn travel bag and pulled out a small, faded identification card holder, the kind used by long-retired service members, though he did not display it openly. The young Air Force officer noticed the movement and paused, her attention sharpening not from suspicion but recognition of something familiar in the careful way he handled it. She leaned slightly toward him and offered a polite greeting, asking if he had served, and the man responded with a simple nod before returning his gaze toward the window where clouds stretched endlessly like white terrain. A few minutes passed before the conversation resumed naturally, this time with the officer introducing herself as Captain Lauren Mitchell, assigned to a joint training coordination unit involving advanced flight operations. The man replied only with his first name, Robert, without elaboration, as if further explanation was unnecessary. The atmosphere between them remained respectful but charged with quiet curiosity, and as the flight continued, Captain Mitchell noticed that several military personnel seated farther back in the cabin had begun to look toward seat 16A with increasing attention. It started subtly, with glances exchanged among themselves, then a shift in posture as recognition spread without a single spoken announcement. Robert remained composed, his hands resting calmly, his breathing steady, while the aircraft crossed over the western mountain range. Captain Mitchell eventually excused herself and walked toward the rear of the cabin where two United States Air Force instructors were seated, and after a brief exchange of words, she returned with an expression that had changed slightly, now carrying a mix of disbelief and respect. She asked Robert directly if he had ever been associated with experimental aviation programs, and for the first time his eyes shifted from the window back to her, meeting her gaze with quiet acknowledgement but no confirmation. The moment lingered, suspended in the steady rhythm of flight, until one of the instructors stood and approached seat 16A, stopping respectfully at a distance, as if approaching someone whose history required space rather than intrusion. The instructor's voice was calm as he addressed Robert using a call designation that carried weight within specialized aviation circles, and upon hearing it, several passengers nearby turned their attention toward the interaction. Captain Mitchell felt a subtle change in the atmosphere, as though the aircraft itself had become quieter, even though the engines continued their steady hum. Robert finally spoke more clearly, not to explain, but to correct the distance between past and present, acknowledging that names and designations belong to different times, different missions, and different skies. The instructor responded with a respectful nod, stepping back slightly, and in that moment Captain Mitchell realized that seat 16 was not simply occupied by an elderly passenger, but by someone whose presence had quietly shaped aspects of modern aviation training she had studied but never personally questioned. The aircraft continued its descent toward San Diego, sunlight breaking through clouds in long golden lines, and the passengers resumed their silence, though the meaning of silence had now changed for those who understood what they had just witnessed. As the aircraft continued its steady descent toward San Diego International Airport, the cabin lighting shifted subtly, reflecting the warm gradient of late afternoon sunlight spilling through the windows, and what had once been a routine flight now carried an unspoken awareness among several passengers who had begun to quietly reconsider everything they thought they understood about the man seated in 16A. Captain Lauren Mitchell remained in her seat for several moments after returning from the rear of the cabin, her tablet resting and used in her lap as her thoughts replayed the exchange she had just witnessed, especially the way senior instructors had reacted to a simple call designation spoken in a calm voice, without emphasis or pride. Robert, meanwhile, remained composed, his gaze steady on the horizon where sky met distant ocean haze, as if the approach to landing held no more significance than any other transition he had experienced countless times before. The aircraft's descent brought the city grid into clearer view, buildings becoming structured patterns beneath scattered clouds, and the cabin crew began preparing passengers for arrival with the standard instructions, though the atmosphere felt different for those who had recognized subtle signals earlier. Captain Mitchell finally stood again, this time not out of curiosity, but out of a need to understand context that had been left intentionally unspoken, and she approached Robert with measured respect, asking if he would be willing to clarify one detail that continued to echo through her training instincts, specifically the call designation she had heard referenced moments earlier. Robert took a slow breath, not as hesitation but as acknowledgement of time and distance, and responded that such designations belonged to a program that no longer existed in its original form, a program built during early experimental aviation development when flight systems were transitioning from mechanical reliability to integrated digital control frameworks. His explanation was not delivered as authority, but as memory, and that distinction changed the way Captain Mitchell listened. She asked carefully if his involvement had influenced current training protocols used in modern flight simulation environments, particularly those involving adaptive response systems used by United States Air Force units, and Robert replied only that lessons learned in earlier decades had a way of resurfacing in unexpected places, often refined by people who never knew their origin. The cabin grew quieter again, not from instruction but from awareness spreading among nearby passengers who had begun to sense that the conversation carried significance beyond personal history. One of the instructors who had previously approached returned briefly, standing at a respectful distance, confirming to Captain Mitchell in a low voice that the designation used earlier was associated with a small group of test pilots whose contributions had been integrated into multiple branches of aviation research, but rarely acknowledged publicly due to classification structures of the time. The aircraft leveled slightly as it approached final approach path, and the city below expanded into full visibility, runways aligning like parallel lines awaiting arrival. Captain Mitchell returned to her seat, her posture more reflective than before, and she looked again at Robert not with confusion, but with recalibrated understanding. Realizing that leadership in aviation history did not always present itself through rank or recognition, but sometimes through individuals who had contributed quietly and moved on without expectation of acknowledgement. Robert finally turned his head slightly toward her, offering a simple statement that training and service were never about being remembered, but about ensuring safety for those who followed, a perspective that softened the weight of everything she had been trying to interpret. As the landing gear deployed and the aircraft aligned with the runway, the cabin's collective focus shifted forward, yet the atmosphere remained altered, as if a layer of unseen history had briefly surfaced and then settled back into place. When the wheels touched down smoothly on the runway, the sound of contact was followed by a controlled deceleration, and passengers began to prepare for disembarkation, though several remained still for a moment longer than usual. Captain Mitchell gathered her belongings slowly, glancing once more towards seat 16A, where Robert remained calm, already returning to the quiet state he had maintained from the beginning of the flight, and in that final moment, she understood that what she had experienced was not an event to be repeated, but a reminder that the history of aviation was carried forward not only in aircraft and systems, but also in the silent presence of those who had shaped its earliest and most delicate transitions. After the aircraft came to a complete stop at the gate, the cabin slowly shifted from the tension of arrival into the routine movement of disembarkation. Yet for those who had been aware of the quiet exchanges during the flight, nothing about the moment felt ordinary anymore. The overhead bins opened, seat belts unfastened, and passengers began to collect their belongings. But Captain Lauren Mitchell remained seated for a brief moment longer, watching the elderly man in seat 16A as he calmly prepared to leave, as if the flight had been no different from any other day. Robert moved with unhurried precision, retrieving his worn travel bag and checking nothing behind, carrying himself with the same steady composure he had maintained from the beginning. As the aisle began to clear, Captain Mitchell finally stood and stepped aside to allow others to pass. But she did not leave immediately, instead observing as two uniformed airport coordination officers approached the front of the cabin with quiet professionalism. They paused near the exit, their attention subtly shifting toward Robert, and one of them spoke softly into a handheld radio before nodding in acknowledgement, as if confirming a scheduled arrival that had not been publicly listed. Outside the aircraft windows, the San Diego airfield was active with movement. Ground vehicles navigating between terminals and aircraft positioned along designated lanes, and beyond the civilian gates, a section of the tarmac revealed the presence of military aviation assets conducting routine operations. In the distance, two F-35 aircraft taxied along a parallel runway, their sleek forms moving with controlled precision under the late afternoon light, and inside their cockpits, pilots prepared for post-flight procedures while scanning external activity as part of standard situational awareness. As Robert stepped into the jet bridge, one of the F-35 pilots glanced toward the civilian terminal corridor and paused slightly, his attention drawn not by instruction but by recognition that seemed to surface instinctively, followed by a subtle adjustment of posture that reflected quiet acknowledgement. The second pilot followed his gaze, and, after a brief exchange over internal communication, both aircraft reduced speed slightly as they continued taxiing, maintaining formation spacing while directing their attention momentarily toward the terminal edge where Robert had just passed through. Inside the terminal corridor, Captain Mitchell had now joined the flow of passengers, but she slowed her pace as she noticed the same shift in behavior among a few uniformed personnel stationed near the gate entrance, who straightened subtly as Robert passed them without stopping or acknowledging them directly. One of the personnel lowered his gaze briefly, then raised it again in a restrained gesture of respect that was not officially required but clearly understood within that environment. Robert continued forward, guided not by attention but by familiarity with transit procedures that required no assistance, and as he reached the exit into the main terminal, the ambient noise of the airport increased, blending announcements, footsteps, and rolling luggage into a steady background rhythm. Captain Mitchell caught up to him briefly at the edge of the corridor, not to stop him, but to speak one final sentence, asking whether moments like this were ever meaningful to him after so many years, and Robert responded without pausing that recognition was never the goal, only the continuation of work that others would carry forward without interruption. As he walked away toward the terminal exit, Captain Mitchell remained still for a moment, processing the meaning behind his words, while behind her the movement of the airport continued unchanged, except for the subtle awareness among those who had witnessed something they could not fully categorize. Outside, the F F-35 aircraft completed their taxi sequence and came to a controlled pause at the designated hold point. And for a brief instant, one of the pilots raised a hand in a restrained salute within the cockpit, not directed at protocol, but at recognition of presence, before returning focus to flight procedures. Robert did not turn back, nor did he acknowledge the gesture. Yet the significance of the moment lingered in the controlled rhythm of the airfield, where history, service, and quiet respect intersected without announcement, leaving Captain Mitchell with the understanding that what she had witnessed would not be recorded in any formal briefing, but would remain permanently embedded in her perception of what service truly meant. The terminal gradually returned to its normal rhythm after the aircraft arrival, with passengers dispersing into the flow of the airport and announcements echoing across the high ceilings. But for Captain Lauren Mitchell, the experience did not dissolve into routine as easily as it did for others, because the events she had witnessed continued to replay in her thoughts with a clarity that felt sharper than anything she had encountered. During structured flight training exercises, she stood near the gate area for several moments after Robert had disappeared into the terminal exit corridor, watching the space he had occupied, as if expecting some additional confirmation that what she had seen was real rather than a convergence of coincidence and interpretation. Behind her, the two United States Air Force instructors who had briefly engaged with Robert earlier approached in a calm but deliberate manner, and their presence immediately changed the tone of her focus from personal reflection to professional curiosity. One of them confirmed that a quiet notification had already been transmitted through internal channels, not as an alert, but as a historical reference acknowledgement, indicating that the call designation spoken earlier had been logged in a restricted archival context tied to early developmental aviation programs that influenced modern simulation doctrine. Captain Mitchell listened carefully, realizing that the significance of the moment was not in dramatic revelation, but in the quiet consistency with which multiple trained professionals had reacted without confusion or contradiction. Meanwhile, at the far end of the terminal, Robert moved through the exit process without hesitation, blending into the civilian environment with the same unassuming presence he had carried throughout the flight, and there was no indication that he sought attention or recognition as he continued toward ground transportation. Outside the terminal, late afternoon light reflected across the airport pavement, and the sound of distant aircraft engines provided a steady backdrop that reminded observers that operations continued regardless of individual moments of recognition. The two F-35 pilots who had briefly acknowledged him earlier completed their taxi sequence and transitioned toward post-flight procedures, and although no formal communication referenced the encounter, their disciplined composure suggested that the moment had been internally acknowledged and then respectfully set aside in accordance with operational professionalism. Inside the terminal, Captain Mitchell eventually walked toward the exit as well, where she paused near a large glass window overlooking the runways, observing aircraft movement patterns that now carried additional meaning for her, not because they had changed, but because her understanding of the people who shaped those systems had expanded beyond technical instruction. One of the instructors joined her briefly and explained in measured terms that certain individuals from earlier aviation development eras were occasionally encountered in unexpected civilian contexts, not as active participants in current operations, but as living links to foundational methodologies that had gradually evolved into modern standards. He emphasized that the importance of such individuals was never in visibility, but in the continuity of knowledge they had contributed, often without expectation of acknowledgement. Captain Mitchell nodded slowly, absorbing the idea that influence in aviation history did not always align with rank, decoration, or public record, but sometimes existed in quieter forms that persisted through systems, procedures, and training frameworks she had used throughout her career without ever questioning their origin. As she prepared to leave the terminal, she looked once more toward the exit where Robert had disappeared, recognizing that there would be no official summary, no formal documentation of the encounter, and no institutional record that could fully capture what had occurred within that brief intersection of lives. The instructors departed in a different direction, and the airport resumed its full operational tempo, with boarding calls, rolling luggage, and steady aircraft departures filling the space with familiar sound. Yet for Captain Mitchell, the experience had created a permanent internal reference point, one that would subtly influence how she interpreted future training scenarios, briefings, and operational discussions. Across the airfield, the last traces of the earlier arrival faded into the broader pattern of daily aviation activity, and the runway lights began to activate as evening approached, signaling the continuation of operations into night cycles. In that transition from daylight to evening, the event did not stand out as spectacle or disruption, but as a quiet reminder that the history of flight was carried not only in machines and systems, but also in the individuals who once shaped them and then stepped away without seeking recognition, leaving behind only the structures that others would continue to use long after their names had left active circulation. The airport continued its steady rhythm into the early evening, with runway lights now fully active and casting long reflections across the wet tarmac as a light coastal breeze moved through the open service corridors. And while operations returned to standard flow, the quiet encounter that had unfolded earlier that day continued to echo within the structured thoughts of those who had witnessed it. Captain Lauren Mitchell had left the terminal and was now standing outside near the passenger pickup area, where vehicles arrived and departed in continuous cycles. Yet her attention was not on transportation logistics or mission schedules, but on the internal recalibration of perspective that had begun during the flight and deepened after landing. She replayed the sequence again in her mind, from the initial observation of Seat 16A to the subtle recognition from trained instructors, to the brief and restrained acknowledgement from F-35 pilots who had responded not through formal communication, but through instinctive professional respect that required no instruction. Each layer of the experience formed a structure of understanding that did not rely on official confirmation, but instead on the alignment of multiple disciplined reactions that had all pointed toward the same conclusion without explicit declaration. Behind her, the terminal doors opened and closed as travelers moved between worlds of arrival and departure, yet she remained still for several moments longer, as if allowing the meaning of the experience to fully settle before moving forward. One of the instructors eventually joined her outside, standing at a respectful distance before speaking in a calm voice that emphasized the importance of continuity in aviation development, explaining that what she had encountered was not an anomaly, but a reminder that modern systems often carry embedded influence from individuals whose contributions were never publicly highlighted. He noted that in aviation history, particularly within experimental and transitional eras, certain figures had shaped procedural logic, simulation frameworks, and adaptive response training methodologies that continued to define current operational standards, even though their names were rarely discussed in contemporary briefings. Captain Mitchell listened without interruption, her gaze shifting briefly toward the runway where aircraft continued to take off in measured intervals, each departure a continuation of systems that had evolved over decades of refinement and collective experience. The instructor concluded by stating that recognition in aviation was not always aligned with visibility, and that some of the most influential contributors chose distance from acknowledgement, focusing instead on ensuring that others could operate safely within systems they helped refine. As night settled further across the airfield, the sky transitioned into deeper shades of blue and black, and the runway lighting became more prominent against the surrounding darkness, creating a visual contrast that reflected the layered complexity of what she had experienced. Captain Mitchell finally spoke, not to question the validity of what had occurred, but to acknowledge its impact, stating that the encounter had altered the way she would interpret training materials, operational briefings, and historical references moving forward, even if no formal documentation ever reflected what she had witnessed. The instructor offered a simple nod in response, understanding that certain lessons in aviation are absorbed through experience rather than instruction, and that their influence often appears later in decisions, awareness, and judgment rather than immediate action. Far from the terminal, Robert had already left the airport grounds and blended into the broader city movement, his presence no longer visible within the operational environment. Yet the effect of his brief appearance remained embedded within the perceptions of those who had interacted with him, creating a quiet continuity between past development eras and present-day aviation practice. Inside the airport control structures, flight operations continued without interruption, with new arrivals being guided to gates and departures cleared for takeoff, each movement following established protocols that had been refined over time through accumulated knowledge. Captain Mitchell eventually turned away from the runway and walked toward her vehicle, her steps steady but reflective, carrying with her the understanding that aviation history is not solely preserved in archives or recognition ceremonies, but also in brief intersections of experience that leave lasting impressions on those trained to recognize their significance. As she left the airport, the final image that remained with her was not of ceremony or announcement, but of quiet professionalism expressed across different levels of service, from ground personnel to pilots in flight, all connected by systems that extend beyond individual awareness and into the collective continuity of aviation progress, where every contribution, whether visible or unseen, becomes part of a larger and ongoing narrative that continues long after any single moment has passed.